Before we begin the proceedings, I would like to acknowledge that we're meeting on Aboriginal land and I pay my respects to the traditional custodians of this country. We're very, very lucky. I don't know if you remember, but today is, are you okay today?
Thanks a lot. I suppose I've got to stand up and do this, standing up. I've been standing up all day. I've flown in from Kalgoorlie just a few minutes ago.
Well, sit down.
That's why I'm sort of wearing this. I went to the race round up there. My electorate basically covers all the mining and pastoral region, which by its very nature is mining. And I started off in the mining industry with BHP in the early 80s and finished up with BHP in 94. What's interesting is that I remember at BHP saying we'd never get above 40 million tonnes per annum of iron ore exported. It was considered impossible. BHP's current target is for 480 million tonnes of iron ore per annum, and they're building a new berth system to take 8 Panamax ships offshore. Announced today, Rio are going to do exactly the same thing. They're aiming, I think it was for a total export of 333 million tonnes per annum. So just bringing those two together, by 2015 we're possibly looking at around about 800 million tonnes of iron ore going out of the ports of the Pilbara. Now I refer back to the last time we had a boom, and that was in 2006. There was a lot of talk about how big we were going to get. And bear in mind that I've just said what we're going to be at by 2015. They suggested in 2006 that by 2025 we might be able to reach approximately, what was the figure, 80 million tonnes. So we're aiming now by 2015 to achieve what they predicted we'd get to in 2025. So what's this done to the region? What's the benefit to the state? Well, first off, state agreement acts that these companies run under prescribe a royalty. Now we can see that Colin Barnett today announced that he was trying to get a greater royalty out of these companies. Now the problem is that because they're a state agreement act, it requires both parties to agree. You can't do it unilaterally. The government has no power over those industries because it is a commercial agreement between the state and the companies. So he's going to have to fight long and hard if they're going to expand to try and get extra royalties out of them. What's happening to those royalties? Very few people actually understand the grants commission process that operates at a federal level. For every $1 billion that we earn in royalties in this state, the federal government, through fiscal adjustment, get to distribute about 70% of that across the other states. And how it works is that each state is given funds by the federal government to make sure that the lifestyle of all the individuals across Australia get the same net benefit. But when it comes to Queensland and Western Australia, because we have our own income stream, i.e. royalties, those royalties are discounted from what we receive from the federal government. So in essence you could say that the 70% that we don't get in Western Australia is amortised over the rest of the states. So there's always been an argument that we should keep more, but because it belongs to Australia, in my view, and not just WA, I think that the process is roughly right. That's where I tend to support a mining tax operated out of the federal government, which actually then starts eating in to those incredible profits that these corporations make. What it's doing to the Pilbara, because of the expansion, and mainly the expansion not in the industry as production, but in the expansion of industry as an expanding industry, has created a massive need for the extra workers up there. Now, you'd think that would have some effect on Western Australia. It would mean that our population was going through the roof. Well, it ain't. Our population hit a peak in expansion of about 5% in 2008-2009, but the projections are that by 2014-15, our expansion rate will be down to around about just over 2%, roughly what it is now. So where are all these workers coming from? A vast majority are actually coming out of the eastern states. We now have fly-in, fly-out of the eastern states. And it's about 50% of our workforce is now coming out of the other states into Western Australia. So where do we house all these people that are coming in? Well, if you want to rent a house in Karratha, you can get a rental somewhere between around about 2,000 and 3,600 a week for a house. So all the people who lived in Karratha now live in Perth because they can rent their houses out and retire basically in Perth on the interest from their properties in the Pilbara. So there are virtually no residential people left, especially in Karratha. There are in Headland, but Headland's starting to go that way. So what's then happening is that royalties to regions, or the government, is putting on significant more money to build more housing. The problem is that there isn't enough water for the housing, so they build the houses and they can't lease them out because they can't get licences from the Water Authority to provide water for the housing. I hope I'm not frightening everybody, but this is the mess that is the Northwest. And it's the mess that I hope the gentleman who's sitting next to me is going to try and solve in a minute.
No problem.
But what I'm trying to do is to paint a picture of an absolutely dysfunctional society up there. We've got McDonald workers in Karratha, a fly-in, fly-out.
Oh, you're kidding.
And they fly in, fly out and live in seatainers in the Karratha industrial estate.
Oh.
If you want to get a plumber in Karratha, you phone up Perth. And you pay for him to fly to Karratha, do his job, and then fly home. NGO sector. If you've got a mental illness, you cannot get anybody to help you because that section of the health services cannot afford to rent a house in Karratha to provide the house for those services. Now, I have had one little win. I want to tell you about a win. BHP, many years ago, when there was a bit of a downturn, had some extra houses. So they turned around to the not-for-profit sector and said, oh, well, look, we've got about 20 houses. You can have them on a temporary lease for your language centre people, your drug and alcohol people, all the various services that upper echelon of NGOs provide. Well, when the upturn came, BHP wanted their houses back. And so we made quite a bit of a stink about it. I spoke to Ian Fletcher of BHP, Marius Botters, a whole range of people saying, look, you have a social responsibility. And as of about 2 weeks ago, BHP committed to handing over 22 old properties to the Department of Housing. BHP committed to handing over 22 old properties to the Department of Housing with a caveat that they could only be leased for the NGO sector. Karratha doesn't have that. Karratha is an absolute mess, and it's going to get worse. As these sort of expansion programs that we're talking about come on stream, they're going to need thousands of extra workers. I also want to then go on to the next stage. Looking at the reserves, and I'll just quote you some figures here, the known reserves of iron ore, and I'll refer to three types. There's measured and indicated, 8,500 million tonnes, reserves of 5,600 million tonnes, and an inferred, which is your guess, of a further 15,600 million tonnes. If we're going to start knocking out in excess of 100 million tonnes per annum, how long is that going to last? And what are we going to be doing in the Pilbara when it's gone? There seems to be this notion at the moment that royalties to regions is going to develop Pilbara cities. When I first went to the Pilbara in 1974, the average stay of a worker was 27 days. Now you might say 27 days, that's interesting. Because you got off the plane, you went, shit, it's hot. And you're there. So the idea that somehow we're going to have this marvellous cities of the north in currently 45 to 50 degrees of heat and having people meandering from house to house getting sunstroke is a nonsense. All that is currently happening with the R4R funding is it's going into housing, which is then being subleased by the mining corporations. So the R4R funding, especially in the Pilbara, is just another method of the state government putting funds into the Pilbara to prop up an industry which it gets the royalties from in the first place, and then through this circular motion hands back to the mining industry. So I watched the Pilbara for a long time, and I actually like it. I would live up there if I could. But I tell you what, as a community that might establish an alternate industry into the future, I don't think it stacks up. I've just come back from Kalgoorlie, and there is a mining centre that potentially does have a future beyond mining. Okay, we've recently had Kalgoorlie Consolidated Gold Mines say they had another 12 years life. And they were trying to do some pretty nasty stuff to their workers as a result of that. We produced a map showing all their gold reserves, which they actually didn't like. We had it published in the newspaper, which showed they had another 40 years of life. So when they went in to negotiate with the unions the next day, they rolled over and the unions got their even time rosters, which was a nice little win on a sideline. But what Kalgoorlie has, it's got a power line to and from Perth. It has some of the best sun, it has low velocity winds, it doesn't get cyclones, and it's the ideal place for solar power. And at the moment there are 2 potential solar power units going in there, one at the Mungari Industrial Estate, which is going to be a large one, and then they're negotiating with Barrick over leases, which are what we call sterile. They've been drilled, there's no ore there, and Barrick are prepared to turn those leases over to a consortium to build a solar tower. So that's some of the sort of future that a mining centre can have. But I can't see that happening in the Pilbara. It's too far away from anywhere for that sort of thing to occur, and you're not going to get industry move up there when you're having to pay wage rates of 200 odd thousand per year to get people to live there. It's just not going to work. So I have a real concern that the Pilbara will not go on beyond the mining industry, and I have a real concern that the money that we're pouring in there at the moment, which was originally royalties money, is actually just a way of subsidising the mining industry. I think that's about all I want to have to say. Well, are we going to do questions?
Yeah,
yeah. After we both done?
Yeah, probably.
Yeah, cool.
Yeah.
That's the best bet. So I'm now going to pass you over to somebody I've admired from afar for a long time, Dennis.
Thanks. Thanks, Robin, and thanks for coming along to the and thank you to Vinnie and others for helping to organise it. The Australian Institute doesn't make it to Perth very often, but it's nice to be here. Look, I just want to give you a brief overview, I suppose, of some research that we've done recently, the findings of which are all relatively heretical, and we're actually saying, can you believe it, that most Australians don't work in the mining industry, most Australians don't benefit directly from the mining industry, and many Australians are actually worse off as a result of the boom. Now, I'll talk to you about this for 10 minutes or so, but it's very important that I make this really clear. I'm not saying that the mining industry doesn't employ anybody or make any contribution. I'm not saying we should shut it down tomorrow. But we are, as a society, in the middle of an unprecedented expansion in the size of this industry. The consequences for our communities, for our environment are enormous. And it's my concern that our policymakers, let alone the public at large, have a very skewed picture of this industry and the contribution that it can make. But again, choosing my words very carefully here, I'm not saying it doesn't make any contribution. The question is, are we getting it into perspective? Now, Robin's talked about the, how many million tonnes did you say of iron ore?
In total left?
No, per year?
Per year, they're currently, they're going for, the two majors will be producing 80 million tonnes per annum.
80 million tonnes per annum. Okay, coal, I know more about. Coal, we are, at the moment, Australia extracts about 400 million tonnes of coal every year. Now, that's a big number, but who cares? Let me help you picture 400 million tonnes of coal. Picture a pile of coal about a metre high, about as tall as this table, and picture a pile a metre high and 20 kilometres wide by 20 kilometres long. That's about 400 million tonnes. Probably doesn't sound that big. Now picture a pile of coal a metre high, a kilometre wide, 400 kilometres long. Or a pile of coal a metre high, 10 metres wide. So picture a road a metre high, 40,000 kilometres long. That's 1 year's coal output in Australia. Okay, every year we make a road a metre high that would go around the world in coal. That's today. We are planning to double, possibly treble our coal output. Right, if the developments that are on the books in Queensland and to a lesser extent WA and lesser extent New South Wales, if all the plans that are on the books go ahead, we're talking about 800 million tonnes a year, possibly 1 billion tonnes a year of coal. Now, to do that will require a massive expansion, and there's a lot of construction activity going on. And in fact, that's where most of the jobs are. Very few people are employed in mining. In Australia, whereas there are lots employed in construction and a bit in manufacturing at the moment, in Australia today, there are about 210,000 people employed directly in mining. 210,000. Now, for those 210,000, that's a very important thing. And by the way, that includes people working at a quarry in Canberra, mining quartz. Okay, that's the broadest definition of mining you could get, and it's about 210,000 people. Now, that's a lot of people, 200,000 people, that fill this room a few times over, but in Australia there's around 21 million people. The mining industry employs 1.9% of the workforce. Put another way, 98.1% of people don't work in the mining industry. Okay, 98.1% of people don't work in the mining industry, and that's Australia-wide. Now, obviously, more people, a larger percentage of people here in Western Australia work in mining. What percentage of West Australians do you think work in mining?
About 5%.
No, directly.
5%.
Yeah, about 88,000 people, about 6 or 7%. Now, I see the AMWUs here. Thanks for coming along. According to the ABS, the manufacturing industry employs more West Australians than the mining industry. You know how manufacturing is a basket case and no one works there anymore, Australia doesn't make anything? Well, there are more people in the manufacturing industry today in Western Australia, let alone Victoria and New South Wales, than in the mining industry. We'll come back to why the AMWU isn't running ads on telly telling you about this later, but let's just say making $40 billion a year in profit for BHP helps to fund a bit of advertising. Now, the mining industry is prone to saying, of course, yes, 200,000, Richard's right, that's what the ABS says, but what about the indirect job creation? We create jobs in manufacturing, we create jobs in construction, we create jobs when all the mining workers fly into Perth and go to the shops and go to a cafe. This is true. This is called indirect job creation. Now, the couple of things that you need to understand about that. The argument by the mining industry is basically, well, look, when mining industry workers get paid, they go buy things, this creates jobs in other industries, and we need to measure that. Yeah, fair enough. We'll talk about how you do that in a second. The implication, however, is that manufacturing workers, or see the CPSU at the back? Yeah, public servants. See, what happens with public servants is that when they get paid, they take the money and they bury it in tins in the backyard. There's no indirect job creation when manufacturing workers get paid. There is no indirect job creation when the manufacturing workers get paid. It's only the mining industry who pay a lot of economists to go and tell everybody about their indirect job creation. All right, I'm here to let you in on a little secret. It's not just the mining industry that creates upstream and downstream jobs. But what the mining industry really hates, and they're not very good at defending themselves, which is nice. They haven't had to defend themselves because they've just got away with this nonsense for so long. But if you want to exaggerate your size, if you want to say, well, sure, I only employ 200,000 people, but what about all the indirect jobs I create? Then it follows that you would have to take responsibility for all the indirect jobs you destroyed.
Yeah.
Okay? I think this is unarguable. Mitch Hook disagrees with me, but that's okay. If you want to claim credit for the spillover benefits, then you have to take responsibility for the spillover costs. Now, the Australian exchange rate is high because we're in the middle of a mining boom. Well, that high exchange rate makes it hard for the manufacturing industry. It makes it hard for the tourism industry. It makes it hard for the education industry. It makes it hard for the agriculture industry. The high exchange rate means that a whole bunch of other sectors of the economy are actually employing fewer people. So if the mining industry wants to take credit for indirect job creation, it follows that it should take responsibility for indirect job destruction. Okay, but funnily enough, the ads on television, do you get them over here? Because in Canberra we're swamped in, so I assume you must get them as well. But, Kellogg's puts an ad on television and assures you that sugary breakfast cereal will make you fit and healthy. Okay, that's okay. That's called advertising, and no one really expects balanced nutritional advice from an ad. You know what I'm heading, don't you? The mining industry puts an ad on television saying, we're your saviour, we're your backbone, without us you're nothing. And people go, oh yeah, fair point. Why would I subject that to any critical evaluation? So, the mining industry employs 200,000 people, which is nice. That's less than the number of people employed in the recreation and arts industry. Okay? It's a quarter of the number of people employed in the manufacturing industry. It's a fifth of the number of people employed in the health sector. The mining industry is not a big employer, full stop. The mining industry doesn't create many indirect jobs, full stop. These are facts. Okay? This is just true. Alright? It's not quite what they say. And I'm not saying that there is no indirect job creation for the mining industry. There is. There obviously is. It's just not very big. The only thing big about the mining industry is the enormous profits. Because, here's the thing, why do you think the profits are so high? Well, because they don't have to employ many people. Okay,
There's not much competition in the mining industry.
There's no competition. I mean, this is the thing with mining. Basically what a mine is a local monopoly over a particular resource. It's a mine. It's mine. Okay, it's a mine. Now, I'm sure that's the etymology of the word. So, it's being recorded, probably regret it later. Now, I grew up in Newcastle, Hunter Valley, north of Sydney. Now, Newcastle's the biggest coal port in the world. Now, if you drive down Hunter Street of Newcastle, you'd swear you're in, a war zone. Every second building is empty. There's graffiti all over the buildings. Bits of Newcastle doing really well, but Newcastle itself does not look, feel, or statistically appear to be a rich community. It's the richest. Sitting on the richest deposit of coal in the world. Exporting more of it than anyone else in the world. And the reason that those two things can happen simultaneously is because The people of Newcastle don't own the coal. Now, if I was a Saudi Arabian and the price of oil goes up, everyone knows the Saudis get rich. Why do the Saudis get rich when the world price of oil goes up? Because they think the oil is theirs. And sure, they might employ a mining company to come and do what they think of as plumbing, because they don't want to get the roads dirty. Okay, so Exxon or Mobil or those people, they're very welcome to come and dig a hole and take the Saudis' oil out for the Saudis so that the Saudis can sell the Saudis' oil. And it's really nice that the oil company came to do the plumbing. But when the world price of oil goes up, the Saudis think they're getting rich. But when the world price of coal goes up, that'll be my mum, when the world price of coal goes up, or the world price of iron ore goes up, or the world price of gold goes up, we don't think, hooray, we're about to get rich. Because we've actually convinced ourselves that the mining companies are doing us a favour. And the favour is they'll create jobs for us. Isn't that nice? They're actually willing to employ us to help do the dangerous part of transferring our resources to their bank accounts.
And their shareholders.
And their shareholders. Now, so my point is, and look, mining companies need to be paid or they won't dig a hole. The Saudis know this. But the Saudis don't for a minute think that people who never purchased the oil or people who never purchased the coal should enjoy 100% of the capital gain when the world price goes through the roof. So we have such a, I hate to say it, we have such a colonised worldview that we actually think that the mining companies are doing us a favour when they extract our resources for us.
And no one sells that better than, or more than Andy Forrest.
Well, no one sells that better than our elected governments, who thank them for coming and who offer them tax concessions if they wouldn't mind terribly coming. So we generally have, it has not occurred to us that these are our resources that are incredibly valuable. We only get to sell them once, and every dollar that we don't tax the enormous profits is a dollar that we'll never ever get back. Now, I don't want to speak for too much longer, and fewer people working in those sectors. Okay, let me just say it again because it's really simple. The bigger the mining boom, the higher the exchange rate. The higher the exchange rate, the less people working in manufacturing. The higher the exchange rate, the less people working in tourism. And the thing that we can control, the thing that tomorrow Robin can fix for us, because I'm putting it back onto him, the thing that we can do tomorrow is start asking questions about how rapidly, if at all, we want this mining boom to continue. I don't have to shut every mine down tomorrow. It's not going to happen. I'm not suggesting that for a minute. But if we allow the coal sector to double, then manufacturing will be decimated. If we allow the iron ore sector to double, then tourism and education will be decimated. This is just going to happen because an Asian student is not coming to study in Australia when the exchange rate's $1.30, they can go to Harvard. Okay? A Japanese tourist is not going to Cairns when they can't afford a hamburger. And there is no chance in the world that Australian consumers or the world's consumers are going to buy a car made in Australia when the exchange rate's at $1.20 or $1.30. So if the boom continues, the exchange rate will go higher and other exports will decline. Now there are two graphs in here that everyone who's involved in the union movement should really have a look at. One shows that since the boom began, mining exports have increased by 5% of GDP and non-mining exports have declined by 5% of GDP. So what impact has there been on exports since the boom began? Zero. We're not in an export boom. We are in a mining export boom.
Profit export.
And a profit export boom. We are not in an export boom. Full stop. ABS stats, not crazy lefty Richard making shit up. Okay? Make up all sorts of shit. This isn't it. Alright, this is just the Australian Bureau of Statistics national accounts. Mining exports up, non-mining exports down. Full stop. The other thing that every union needs to pay attention to is that step one, productivity in the mining sector, labour productivity in the mining sector has halved since the boom began. Right? It's not because mining workers are lazy, it's because mining workers are being asked to dig in less and less productive sites. Mining output has fallen per worker from 1.2 million per worker to 600,000 per worker. It's halved. That's an enormous decline in productivity. When you take the mining sector out of the national productivity statistics, the non-mining sector's productivity growth hasn't slowed at all. Okay, let me just repeat that. ABS stats, not crazy lefty Richard stats. According to the Australian Bureau of Statistics, productivity growth in the non-mining sector of GDP, steady as she goes, rising quite nicely, thank you.
Yeah, the monopoly thing comes in again, because when you're a monopoly you can be as inefficient as you like.
Well, no, at gold at $1,800 an ounce says give a kid a magnifying glass and tell him to go see if you can't find some. Alright, it's not the most productive way to look for gold, but $1,800 an ounce you'll have a crack. My point is we're having a debate about what kind of IR reform we need, what we need in Australia to cope with declining productivity, when the only reason productivity is declining is... Yep.
I was going to say, it's a like a side thought sort of thing with that. You see, my grandfather for years, he in the 60s, 50s and 60s, he worked up out of Whitnoon for Hammersley Iron, Lang Hancock, and he was saying the iron ore that they were mining then was, the quality stuff basically, they had a density out of their ore body, whatever. It's between hematite and magnetite, I think. I don't know the difference, but basically he's saying what they're mining now with...
the magnetite's the crap that Andy Forrest wants to get out of...
it's not worth bugger all, I mean, you may as well go and collect rust out of the scrapyard, out of the landfill, that's basically what my grandfather was telling me, and that's where your productivity is, so...
Yeah, but the thing is, because the world price is so incredibly high, those kinds of activities become commercially viable. But my point is, because we don't understand the mining industry, because we're watching these bloody ads on television rather than reading the national accounts, we're having a debate in Australia about what to do about a slump in productivity, when the only cause of the slump is a massive expansion in a sector that's experiencing a very rapid decline in productivity. And if more of your economy is coming from the bit with declining productivity, that drags the national average down. Similarly, we're telling ourselves that we're in the middle of an export boom. Well, our current account deficit is heading to Banana Republic territory. The IMF tips Australia's current account deficit will be 6.5% of GDP by 2013. It was 6.5% when Keating said we're heading for Banana Republic. How do you have a current account deficit blowing out in the middle of an export boom? Well, you can't. But we're not in the middle of an export boom. We're in the middle of a mining export boom. Australia's exports are not rising. Australia's exports are being swapped from the non-mining sector to the mining sector. So to conclude, mining industry employs some people. Those people spend money in cafes, and that creates jobs in cafes. And you might be surprised. Maybe I'm wrong. Maybe public servants do actually buy a coffee from time to time. Or do you bury it all in the ground?
We bury it.
You bury it all? How about your workers? They're burying it all?
Yeah.
Okay. Well, that's what's blowing us out of the water there. All we need to do is actually start spending some money. But the problem is that the mining industry is spending a fortune on advertisements that tell the public that they're the backbone of the nation. That's okay. Kellogg's is telling us that Nutrigrain will make your kids fit rather than fat. Okay, and there's a whole bunch of shit on television where the ads lie to you. But we're not seeing the mining industry as that. Yeah.
Can I just mention something? I really appreciate your feedback on this.
Yep.
I've been a recruiter for about 7 years. And so I've been riding the mining boom in my career for that time. So that's why it's hard for me to accept when you say that there's not, the jobs aren't being, because my job's being directly affected, how much I get paid,
Yeah.
and how easy it is for me to get a job.
Yeah.
I've been directly affected by that, and the mining boom
Yeah.
has determined that. So that's why I'm a little bit confused.
Like I said at the beginning, I'm not saying mining doesn't employ someone. Sorry, I'll come to you in a sec, Brian. I'm not saying that at all. It now employs 205,000 people, which is a huge boom. It's up from 150,000 people a few years ago.
Sure.
But 50,000 people is pocket change in a population of 21 million Australians. 22 million. Well, I always like to underestimate.
Queensland also is going through a boom as well.
I know, they've got just over 3% of their workforce working in mining.
I just find it really hard
Bit of a go at this.
I know, but here's the thing. I'm talking about the Australian Bureau of Statistics data,
Yeah.
and they might be completely wrong, or it might be that people suffer from a whole bunch of observation biases. That once you buy an Audi, you see lots of Audis on the road. And once you buy a new pair of shoes, you see other people wearing those shoes. And once you work in the mining industry, you hang out with people who work in the mining industry.
Wear fluoro shoes.
Or fluoro. Sorry, Robin wants to make a point. But I'm not saying that people in the mining industry aren't enjoying benefits from the mining boom. And I'm not saying that the people who enjoy benefits from the mining boom don't create a job in a cafe somewhere. They absolutely do.
The issue is when you're if you're in mining, actually getting another job in another sector is almost impossible, because they judge the fact that you've been in the mining sector and you're on those exorbitant dollars, and they won't give you a chance. So I have to pretty much fabricate a full CV if I'm going to get employment out of the mining sector, and that's my experience. So I just wanted to share that with you.
Oh no, I'm glad you did. And again, because it gives me sorry, Rob, I'll give you the mic in a sec, but it gives me the opportunity to remind people that I'm not saying no one works in mining and that hasn't experienced a boom, but we are getting the big picture story about what that means across a vast continent with 21 million people in it. That mining could double from 200,000 to 400,000, and that would still make it a small employer.
But do you think that's actually different in a state like WA in particular?
Look, I just want to respond a little bit to that, because I certainly think there is this incredible issue of a huge employment issue. But one of the problems we've got is the mobility of workforce these days. What's actually happening, as I said, back in 1975, the average day of a worker in the mining industry in the Pilbara was 27 days. By the 1980s, we were up to 2 years. Interesting enough, by the time the major strikes occurred in 1988, the average day of a worker was between 8 and 10 years on a mine. We're now back to the average day of a worker being a year. If you're working in the goldfields, you're aiming to get into the Pilbara. If you're working over east, you're aiming to get into the goldfields. And then once you're in the Pilbara and you've earned your 200,000 a year, you go to Europe for a year and piss it all against the wall. And then you come back and you start again. So that's the problem with employment. Now BHP have just woken up to this, because they were a huge employer of fly in, fly out. And it costs them around about 200,000 to skill up a worker to work in their mine. By the time they've done all the training, by the time they've given all the clothing and everything else they need to do. And so they were saying, well, what's now going wrong? We're just putting this money into workers and they're going. They are now considering going back to regional employment, regional housing, and you take your family up there. They want to get out of certain aspects of fly in, fly out. Not at all their mines, because obviously remote satellite mines won't cater for that. But it's actually that massive big circle that we've seen right from the start of the 80s or 70s to the 80s. Now a lot of the guys that you're getting in or trying to get into the mining industry are just replacing somebody who's been there for a short time and is shot through. And that's the issue with major wages.
That's not 100% true, because what happens is that you've got the one mine and then they'll recruit all of those people from that mine site to the next mine site.
Yeah.
So people are getting moved around to all the different mine sites. So And some of us are actually, I've been trying to get out of the mining sector for so long, for about 4 years,
Yeah.
and I just, they keep dragging me back, so it's,
Well,
it's hard, and that's what they do, that's what this industry is doing, and I just, for all of us, I think it's really interesting to let you guys know that.
I'm a politician. I'm on good money.
Yeah.
I'd love to be back in the mining industry. I can tell you. When I went to the Pilbara in the 70s, I was on $350 a week. The average wage in Perth was $60. Comparative. And we had a ball. And the guys up there at the moment are having a ball on that sort of money. The other problem that we're not factoring into this, and I'm sorry it's slightly obscure, is that fly in, fly out is the greatest social disease that we have got in this country, in terms of not while you're doing it, but the moment you finish, you go home and you say, honey, I'm home.
Yeah.
Well, who are you, for a start off? And look, I've had to put up with you for 3 months now, and I'm really not into it. And the divorce rate post-mining, fly in, fly out, is 70%. Not while you're doing it, but after the event. While you're doing it, it's really good. Whoever's at home, be it male or female, learns to operate independently and starts enjoying some of that independence. The kids relate to that person as their real carer. And occasionally, this male or female comes home with lots of toys. And the child goes, I've got this auntie or uncle who comes home. With, lots of goodies, I like him. But when he comes back, or she comes back on the full time, the goodies aren't there, and he gets in the way of the one-on-one relationship that child has had with parent. So I actually think that is one of the most dangerous things that we've got socially and in the long term financially as a result of the fly-in, fly-out industry. I've been battling FIFO for years, and interesting enough, many years ago, different hat, as a member of the Mining Union Association in the 80s, on behalf of Keating, I went into the unions and told them they had to support fringe benefits tax. And it was fringe benefits tax that unfortunately started FIFO. And it's been a massive problem ever since.
Brian, I cut you off before.
Very interesting discussion. Most of you haven't told me much that I didn't already know. But none of you have made any mention of the fact that this enormous boom is being driven by China. And the question whether it's going to continue is tied up very much with what's happening in China. And to put that in perspective, in 10 years ago, China produced about 9% of the world's steel, 50 million tonnes. It now produces about 45%, and its total steel production is about just under what the world produced 10 years ago. Now the world has doubled. Now it's a question that practically all that increase in steel production has gone and been consumed in China. And one of the reasons for this is somewhere between 15 and 20 million people a year are moving from rural areas with a farming frugality to cities. To put that in perspective, it's a population of every 5 weeks. And that is starting to run out because there's not enough people to move. Over 50% of the Chinese population now lives in cities. And a large amount of that increased steel production has gone to building those cities. And the Chinese government is now, both for social unrest reasons and because of the inability to continue this process, is starting to have a shift of focus from production to consumption. And I think it's safe to say that the current boom in Chinese production of steel and with it the consumption of coking coal and iron ore is probably at its peak now and is going to start flattening out. I don't think BHP Billiton and Rio Tinto and that really understand this.
Look, I think that there's a hint. We're calling it a boom. There's something that comes after booms.
Not just a boom again.
But there's something that comes after booms. And Australians, like most people in Western societies, have a short attention span, a short version of history, and an incredible optimism when riding the upside of a boom. So, no, I don't think China's demand for steel will continue on the trajectory it's on. But let's not forget that we're talking about, we're just talking about fly in, fly out. When it comes to steel, China does ship in, ship out. Right? We actually send coal and iron ore to China to make steel, which we import from them. I mean, that's a pretty weird economic process. And a lot of China's growth in demand comes from two things. One, the increasing incomes of a very large number of very poor people. And two, that countries like Australia have sort of contracted out manufacturing to China for many, many years. And those two things are sitting on top of each other right now. So, no, that part of the boom won't continue. But look, when the enormous new volume of coal and iron ore comes on, the price will fall. There's one thing I'll guarantee you as economists, there's only one thing I'll make predictions about, and that is if you double or treble the supply, the price will fall. The incredible undue haste of this mining boom is mining companies effectively fighting with each other to be there before the boom busts. Because 5 or 10 years of that action is 5 or 10 of the sweetest years you'll ever get. So the boom will end, if only because of the massive construction we're pouring into it. And here's the one, can we remember, I have to go back to Saudi Arabia. Can we remember, I have to go back to Saudi Arabia. The Saudis think the way to get rich is to restrict your output. Australia thinks the way to get rich is to treble your output. One of us is completely wrong. Sorry, in the white shirt.
Yeah, thanks. I just wondered, have you looked at any of the sort of health externalities related to this cost? There's been some really interesting work, particularly in the coal industry, some work from the United States a few months ago, showing that basically externalised costs of coal actually make coal more expensive than just about any other form of energy production. But of course, that also applies to mining as well, and there are a lot of externalities. Climate change is obviously a very good example. But also other sort of local health costs, and people who live near mines have higher rates of heart disease, lung disease, etc., etc. And I suppose that could be argued that's a growth industry related to mining, is that we're actually increasing the size of the health sector. But have you actually...
That's one of those indirect jobs I like to talk about.
Although the health sector is obviously the biggest employer in Australia.
And they're in the CPSU, so... HSU, sorry.
Does your work actually look at some of the sort of the health implications and costs related?
No, it doesn't. I mean, that paper I referred to before simply takes Australian Bureau of Statistics, Australian Tax Office, and some Reserve Bank data and says, here is what the official stats say about the mining industry. You're spot on. Excuse me about the negative health and other externalities associated with the industry. There's been almost no work done in Australia on that. Again, I grew up in the Hunter Valley. When I first moved next to BHP Steel Mill in Mayfield, Newcastle, I got my first dose of asthma. It lasted the 4 years of my time at Newcastle Uni, and then
coincidence.
Like pure coincidence. But then they shut down the steel mill, so I think it's all right. So some people are starting to do that work, and I guess my point would be that all that data will simply add to the weight of this. Here's the story. Here's the bullshit story that we are trying to help people unpick. At the moment, we're told, sure, you might like mining for its impact on the community. Sure, you might not like it for its impact on the environment. Sure, you might not like it for health. But by gee, it keeps our economy strong. Well, what if that bit was completely wrong? Then what are we accepting all those downsides for? So that's why we've started with the economic stuff, because I think they've got feet of clay.
I just want to touch on health. As a convener of the Metallers up in the Pilbara for many years, one of the issues that we faced was that there was significant evidence around that indeed the workers were going to get problems associated with the inhalation of iron ore dust, especially under particles under 0.25 parts per million. Now, there were some cases where people died in Port Hedland, where post-mortems were carried out. And I've got the results of those post-mortems, and they show positive to several ounces of iron ore dust being in the bottom of lung tissue that occurred. So the union in those days went to the government, which was the Labor government under Burke, and sort of said, well, we're really concerned about this. But because the industry keeps the records of how many years you work in a mine, and you don't pass that on to the health department, when somebody dies of cancer or whatever else in Sir Charles Gardner, they can't actually pin that to your work area. They only record it as died of cancer or died of mesothelioma or whatever else in Perth. And now the radiation industry is somewhat different. You have to have, you carry with you your personal records of working in the industry. The mining industry, broadly, you don't do that. So we actually have no knowledge other than the work that Robert Vajakovic has done with the Whitman guys of work history and the legacies. Now, quite clearly, there were impacts. Whether we can actually attribute a percentage of cancers here in Perth to people who worked in the iron ore industry, I don't know. But what we do know is in Canada, iron ore miners who worked with iron ore that contained siderite had an 80% death rate after 20 years of completing their mining activity. That isn't the case here. We don't have siderite. But do we have other silicas? I think that it's a latent problem. It's never been properly addressed.
Yep, in the middle. We've probably only got time for a couple more questions. I'm chairing myself, but I don't want people to feel stuck.
Okay, my question is to you, really. You've talked about the jobs and so on, but what about many Australians or shareholders of these mining companies? How much of those dividends or the proceeds from mining go out to other countries and how much remain within?
Yeah. Look, it's a fascinating point. So basically the estimates are that about 83% of Australian mining is foreign owned. Now, the fun part is people think we export the profits. It's I hate to tell you, it's worse than that. Imagine that you were a Chinese steel mill who'd just taken receipt of a shipment of coal from Xstrata, okay, or a shipment of iron ore from Xstrata. So you got a Swiss-owned mining company sells a shipload of Australian coal to a Chinese steel mill. Where do you think the Chinese send the cheque?
To Switzerland.
London.
Exactly. It never comes to Australia. We actually, we include it in GDP. We include it in our national accounts. And we even have the metaphor that we're exporting the profits, which is true in some metaphorical level. But in reality, it's actually worse. The money doesn't ever come here. Because why would we? Why would they send it here? That's just the idiots that gave it to us for free. Yes, the Swiss then post a small cheque to cover the small number of people who work for them, and yes, they pay a pittance in royalties for some of this stuff. But we think that Australia is swapping money for coal and then sending profits overseas. The big kids are sorting that out directly between themselves. They just send a boatload of supplies down to the colonists every now and then. Yeah, sure.
Just give you a quick response to something ludicrous. When we signed the State Agreement Acts here in Western Australia, the idea was that we were going to get a 10% royalty for our iron ore, but we get 7.6% because we allowed the iron ore companies to build railroads all through the Pilbara. Do you know who owns those railroads when the mining companies are gone? the West Australian government. What are they going to do with near enough 2,000 kilometres of rail line that goes nowhere because there's no mining left?
Tourism.
Yeah.
Oh, look, I noticed on your flyer that you were going to address maybe three issues which I think are still quite big, and that is in 2008 the GFC started, and as other people have indicated here, once that GFC is still there and it's not going away and it will continue, this is going to eventually impact on China because demand will also start to decrease in the developed world. And I'd also like to say, what about greenhouse gas emissions? Are they impacted on by mining in the Pilbara? And what's the impact on Indigenous communities and specifically the Injibandi people who are doing battle with over native title with animals?
Yeah, look, I don't think I'll be able to answer all those questions right now. But look, in terms of the GFC, Australia didn't suffer from the excesses of the GFC, but we've had recessions before and we'll have recessions again. What concerns me is that if we are sacrificing the breadth of our economy for the short-term cash of the mining boom, given that history tells me that booms end, I fear that we'll be far more exposed to native title, but we've not given them any bargaining power, and funnily enough, they haven't struck good deals.
Just two things. Firstly, let's do with CO2. We've had a researcher working on us on evaluating what WA's CO2 emissions have been, or are going to be. Now, the federal government says we're on 76.1 million tonnes of CO2 per annum currently. Our research, going through quantified data, of which we don't have it all, indicates that we're currently on 81 million tonnes of CO2 per annum in Western Australia, with around about 30 major corporations not accounted for in that. We have to remember that any amount of CO2 below 250,000 tonnes is not accounted for at a federal level.
25.
25. Yeah, sorry. And that in Western Australia, the EPA won't look at any project for a CO2 perspective unless it's over 100,000 tonnes. Having done that, our forward projections are a further 73 million tonnes of CO2 per annum based on known developments that are coming on stream. None of this is guesswork, it's all from company documents. We've written to most of the companies. Companies have come back to us with their figures. They've asked us not to publish which company and what industry, but we now know that we're on target for 150 million tonnes of CO2 per annum at least. What then becomes the problem is that we actually were on 54 million tonnes of CO2 per annum in 1995, the figure that we said we would actually only allow an 8% exceedance of. Just coming back to the horrors of native title and what's been going on with the Injibandi people at various locations around the country, the state government is currently rewriting the Indigenous Heritage Act to remove the rights of Indigenous people to protect heritage.
Oh, it's terrible.
They brought a specialist over who rewrote the Queensland Act, and it will disband the ACMC, the Aboriginal Cultural Materials Committee, put in place an industry-based reporting system, no confidentiality over any site ever again. It all must be on the records at Mines Department. It is going to make an absolute mockery of the whole issue of heritage in this state.
What's the purpose of native title then? You can't, because that's how the Native Title Act works, is that you have the WA Aboriginal Heritage Act, which says that various sites have significance.
Exactly.
We should probably just take one more question. You pick.
A greenhouse guy over in the corner.
I'm going to be rude and throw in a few comments as well. You were talking about the exporting of coke and coal and obviously iron ore and then importing steel. Probably what's not very well known is the fact that relies on the economics of bunker fuel derived from crude oil being cheap enough essentially that we can do that, and that's obviously not going to be the case for very much longer at all. So we're going to run into a huge issue there where we've shut down a lot of steel manufacturing and then can no longer afford to import it because it's just uneconomical to export it. He also talks about Saudi Arabia being an example of exporting their oil, but I could be wrong, but as far as I understand it, the vast majority of Saudi Arabian oil is produced and exported by Saudi Aramco, which is a state-owned institution, same as in Iran, Brazil, etc., and they're actually the largest oil companies in the world. But if you think of it from that point of view, they receive the profits for their non-renewable resources that they're exporting to the rest of the world, and of course they absolutely control their quota system to maximise that. And I actually grew up in Karratha, and up until from the age of 10 till I was 17, I had to come down to uni, and I remember like our family home was like a 3-bedroom, 2-bathroom place, had a big swimming pool, and it was something like 130,000 when we bought it in the mid-80s. I think it's probably worth well over $1 million now. It would be. I don't want to say who, but I have relatives that work in both the health sector and in the oil and gas industry, and I know for a fact that you've got the more than 20-year-old Karratha Hospital, which is literally falling apart, can't service the community, and couldn't really even 10, 15 years ago. Yet, I think it's Woodside has a Cessna fueled and ready to go, sat on the tarmac for any mining industry worker that suffers an accident, so they immediately get shipped down to Perth. There's no way in hell that we're going to be able to get those necessary health workers to as you said, they just simply cannot afford the rent. And now the question is similar to what Tam was just saying before about those indirect employees. So it's not an argument against what he's saying. It's just, the anecdotal experience. I know maybe 5 people who work directly for, say, Rio Tinto, BHP, and so on. But I know quite a large number of people who work in indirect industries, so they might be engineers but work for environmental consultancy, but a lot of their work is mining companies, they work in IT, and it's the same deal. Environmental scientists, even sustainability practitioners, and they are often employed by mining concerns. So it can be really difficult to argue with the average citizen in Perth and WA when you say that there aren't all these indirect jobs being created, or it's not of the magnitude that it appears. Because it really seems to be all around you all the time.
And look, the perception thing is, again, what we do in the report. We surveyed 1,400 people and asked them, what percentage of people do you think work in the mining industry? The average Australian thinks it's 16%. And the answer is 1.9. It's an 800% error. I'm not saying that you don't know lots of people who work in those industries, but let's take the mining industry's own numbers. 200,000 direct, 600,000 indirect. That's 800,000 all up. Now that's probably 100% wrong. No, it's like about 400,000, but let's take their number and make it 800,000. Let's chuck another 200,000 on just to be friendly. Now that gets you to 1 million. So that's the mining industry's biggest exaggeration, exaggerated by another 20%. And that would get you to 10% of employees.
Is that country or?
Yeah. Right. So I'm not saying you don't know lots of people that work in mining.
Yeah,
I
suppose my point was WA specific, trying to make
it's just not that big.
Yeah.
Okay, look, can I just give you a government figure? Out of all the iron ore industry, you've got the iron ore industry, you've got Hammersley Iron, you've got Rio, you've got BHP, Hope Downs, FMG, whole range of small ones coming on stream. How many people do you think work in the mining industry in Western Australia? And I'll give you the government figure. Somebody come up with a figure.
It's not just the operators.
I'm just talking about the contractors. This is the contractors, everybody who actually works in the mining industry.
80,000, 60.
27,000. What the hell? State figures. Department of Mines and Petroleum. That's the total amount of people, including subbies, who work in the mining industry.
All right, I really enjoyed the talk. And the situation is even worse, so they deserve a big applause.